Welcome to BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. My name is Brian Runciman. I'm hosting this webinar today, Cybersecurity in a COVID-19 World. There's some big changes going on in life, as we're all very, very well aware, and that's obviously going to have security implications as well. So we've got two people that really know what they're talking about in this area. Mike Sheward is a security lead at an IoT company in San Francisco called Particle. So we'd like to welcome you, Mike.
Thank you.
And we also have David M., who is Principal Security Researcher at Kasperksy, and also, as you said to me, at home. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much, Brian. Good to be here.
So we'll get on to the meat of the conversation shortly. Just first of all, I'd like to talk to you about a campaign that BCS are doing. Just coming up on your screen now, Vital Worker campaign, notice the capital IT. This is to do with us just celebrating all the work that's being done in the industry right now to support in difficult times. We know from history that IT departments, IT professionals sometimes get their blame for things which are way beyond their control. Project management failing to string to mind straight away, but at the moment, people are seeing the benefits of all the hard work over the years that's been done on our infrastructure and communication software and so on and so forth. So on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook, this campaign's going. If you'd like to nominate somebody who you think's done outstanding work, please use the Vital IT Worker hashtag and get involved with that. We've already had a lot of nominations, and we want to celebrate the good work that's going on. If you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, either Mike or David, please use the little drop-down menu at the bottom, pretty much at the bottom of your control pad for GoToWebinar. It's called questions. You can type stuff straight in there, and we'll pick that up later. So we'll have about half an hour conversation, and that'll be about 10 or 15 minutes. So the plan is to be finished our broadcast by 6:15. So let's start then by discussing where things are at the moment. So the bad actors, this is where we're going to start, gentlemen. So can I ask, first of all, what new behavior is arising as a result of this pandemic? Perhaps I could start with you, David, on that.
Sure. I mean, I think, probably the obvious one, and we've probably all encountered it already, is the fact that the people behind phishing scams are latching on to COVID-19. Now, these guys are always on the lookout for a hook to try and lure us. And it could be sporting events like the Olympics, it could be natural disasters, it could be peak shopping times such as Black Friday. But at the moment, of course, they've got a great hook because it's something which isn't here today and gone tomorrow. It's going to be with us for some time. They know also that there's an awful lot of people who are, perhaps not as secure as they would have been within the corporate systems, and therefore they've got a bigger potential pool of victims. So that's the first thing is phishing scammers. We're also seeing, apart from people just trying to grab information, people also trying to spread malicious code, and they're doing that in several ways, but sometimes they're relating that to the pandemic. Other times, and we've seen quite a bit of this as well, we've seen malicious applications masquerading as group meeting applications such as Zoom, WebEx, and so on.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few. You've received a new document. A new document has been shared with you. Type emails. Is that the sort of thing we should expect a lot more of?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of that kind of stuff, and also, people purporting to peddle information that's coming from the World Health Organization or the NHS or the government, and try to redirect us to spoofed websites. Where from their point of view, what they hope to do is to capture our information because we think we're on the real site.
Absolutely. So, Mike, can I bring you in here? What's your perception of the new things that are arising at the moment, or is it new, or is it just perhaps variations on old themes?
It's new and variations, right? So everyone is always looking to take advantage, as David said, of the latest and greatest trends. I think one statistic that I read recently was a 350% increase in phishing directly related to coronavirus, which is obviously significant. And then I think just playing on other factors as well. Obviously, a lot of companies have had to pivot very quickly to turn around and get remote workforces engaged. And that's resulted in maybe changes to infrastructure to facilitate that, which are then taken advantage of as part of any other ongoing attack. The other thing as well is that kind of overnight, a lot of companies lost their network level visibility and baselines, or they changed because people have gone from working within the confines of a kind of traditional trusted corporate network to working remotely. And so we can expect people to take advantage of that new lack of visibility. And I guess one that's kind of very US specific, 80 million people today are about to get their US Treasury stimulus checks. Anytime there's the exchange of money, especially in a government process over here, it becomes a very valuable target for obvious reasons for people who are, cyber criminals and traditional scam artists, essentially, that are trying to take that money. And so there are lots of very specific theme scams going on around, either purporting to be the government delivering that money or having some kind of process to increase it that obviously people are trying to take advantage of.
So how are criminals attacking applications and networks other than the phishing sort of scams? What other sort of direct attacks are going on, David?
Well, I mean, they're doing certainly all of the stuff that they've been doing all along. I guess, one of the key differences, I suppose, and Mike alluded to this, is the fact that we've got changing business practices forced upon us. And they're very well aware of the fact that, we're not sitting behind that corporate firewall. And in the case of big companies, they have fairly well established procedures for managing people working remotely. But for small and medium-sized businesses, that's often not the case. And what that means then is that you potentially have somebody who is an outlier from the corporate network point of view, but who nevertheless then has an entry point into the organization and potentially therefore becomes the weakest link. So, they're looking really to try and do similar thing to what they've always done, but with the recognition that if the infrastructure isn't in place to manage people's remote working, then maybe there's the potential for rich pickings from them. And, beyond that, what I said earlier in terms of the phishers are doing what they've always done in trying to just scam us one way or another, by latching on to what is topical news and getting that way. Because let's face it, whether we're talking about opportunist cyber criminals or sophisticated attackers, tricking individuals into doing something that jeopardizes corporate security, it's always been a common first step for launching an attack.
I mean, you make an interesting point there about sort of opportunist attacks. Do you think there's the likelihood that other people might just see this as something just a little bit easy to do right now when work's going to start becoming a little bit more uncertain? What do you think about that, Mike?
Absolutely. A lot of cybersecurity comes down to the human element, right? And I think at the start of this epidemic, we attempted to try and kind of align our response kind of to what's been done before, and in information security we're all very focused on processes and standards and things like that. So a lot of people that I know in the industry kind of started off trying to align the response generally with that, but as it kind of grew and became the situation that we're in today, we started to realize that's kind of bigger than anything that we've all dealt with before. It's a historical event, so people are distracted, people are obviously very anxious, and I know in my own family people have been directly affected in terms of jobs in the economy, thankfully not by the virus yet, but it's obviously a very distracting thing to always have in the back of your mind, and that will translate itself into cyber risk fairly readily, because people are probably kind of ducked down right now, just getting on with things, trying to stay, focused and trying to stay productive. And in doing that, not wanting to kind of rock the boat and raise issues that they may see that they may otherwise do in kind of normal times. That's kind of a natural human behavior that can be amplified here and that could be taken advantage of. And then the other thing as well is that just kind of for some people, if they were used to kind of like a walk-up IT support situation where they could go walk up and show somebody something on a screen, if they're more comfortable with that model, that's obviously gone away now, and it would involve kind of an engagement related to doing something remotely, which may be new and something that people kind of hesitate to do. So for security teams, to kind of counter that, we've all got to be superhuman and understand that people, are having genuine, having an emotional and rough time out there, and maybe be a bit more outreachy and a bit more engaging with people than we would have been previously, to make sure that we maintain those good relationships that help us respond and detect things better than if we didn't have them.
So that's the trust element with the teams you work with, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And you can't really run a security team without trust. An effective security team will always be a trusted partner with other aspects of the business. Otherwise, it won't be successful.
Yeah. Now, you notice my other question on this particular slide, chaps, is social engineering tactics. David, you talked about the phishing a little bit. Are there other social engineering tactics that might be sort of evolving right now that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, I think it's phishing and social engineering generally is always something of a moving target, in that although what underlies it is trying to manipulate human psychology, there's always some new hook, and it's the fact that the current situation, both in terms of business practices and in terms of the pandemic, are providing perfect hooks. And as Mike said, people are concerned about their personal health and well-being. They're concerned about their jobs. They're concerned about where they're going to get food. And on top of that, they've got this whole thing. Those of us who are lucky enough to be able to work from home, we've got the whole issue of, right, how am I productive, and how do I sort of manage to work in a secure way? And often, of course, with the world turned upside down, as it is actually, sometimes security and privacy comes second or third or fourth down the list, behind maintaining business continuity somehow. And we're seeing this, worked out at a business level, but also in a personal level. I mean, a lot of the attention recently focused, for example, on Zoom, has been around, if you like, the housekeeping aspects of managing meetings, rather than what's intrinsically secure or insecure about the platform. And people, for example, sharing logins publicly, or not having private meeting IDs, all the kind of stuff which is important, but actually when the thing that's uppermost in your mind is got to reach out, got to get everyone in the same place and get on with business, then some of those things get overlooked.
Do you think that some of the criticism of Zoom was perhaps a little bit over-egged in that sense, that they were sort of cosmetic security rather than fundamental security issues, for a better expression?
Well, I think there's probably two things going on there. I mean, Zoom has been quick to kind of respond and look to tighten up on the things that it sees as its responsibility. I mean, there's been criticism, for example, about the level of the quality of the encryption that they use, and clearly their understanding of end-to-end encryption is not necessarily the same as that generally understood. But then there's the other aspect of it, which is about how we all use a particular platform, and in a sense, this is no different, in reality to what was happening before, in the sense that, what I do online in terms of logging into online accounts to do shopping or socializing, part of that is the responsibility of the provider. I expect the Amazons, the Googles of this world to keep my data secure, to provide a secure mechanism for connecting. But equally, You know, I've got a responsibility to make sure that the devices I'm using are protected, that they're up to date, and also that, you know, I'm not just using the same login across all different platforms, and that's really important. So there's a dual responsibility always.
Yeah, one hook that I was going to mention from a social engineering perspective is obviously, as there's been this kind of scramble to get people working remotely and into things like VPNs and remote access portals and stuff like that. That's a huge social engineering vector for support teams that are obviously trying to dish out and provision accounts to people that may not have previously had that level of access or had a need for it. So there's been a lot of, you know, reported issues with kind of very specific targeted attempts to trick help desks and support teams into provisioning access to people that may not otherwise or that may not be the right people to have that. So that's a huge risk.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a good point, because you know, we're obviously dealing with a situation here where I mean, I guess in the past, by and large, people who were operating in that way, you know, it was well established. There were well established practice for doing it. People who were doing it, obviously, IT departments could provision that, get people up to speed. When quite suddenly, we've got effectively a whole world of newbies, if you like, who are new to this and don't really necessarily understand all of the aspects of it that they need to know.
I think you raised a very interesting point there, David. And I think one of the things that we'd like to talk to is about those organisations that maybe don't have, you know, a chief information security officer, maybe don't have these existing plans and policies and processes in place. You know, smaller charities, smaller organisations. I mean, we talked about, you know, sort of threat intelligence, but what should these smaller organisations be doing in this new world you described? What kind of practical things should these small organisations be doing?
Well, I mean, in many ways, small organizations have got, they represent the same target that any business does. So people that are interested in using them as stepping stones to get to somebody else, interested in their intellectual property, interested in their customer data, interested in just sheer disruption. And yet at the same time, they've got all the potential weaknesses sometimes that an individual consumer would have as well, in terms of, you know, they don't have the in-depth technical knowledge, they don't have the awareness of what the potential risks are. And the key thing is, of course, that, you know, business continuity is really high up on the agenda. And I would say that, you know, if a couple of years ago, the Australian Signals Directorate put out you know, their guidance really, and their estimation was that even 70% of targeted attacks, forget the opportunist stuff, targeted attacks could be reduced with 4 things. The first 2 are very similar. One is update operating systems. The second was update applications that are being used. The third was develop a default deny kind of process whereby you only allow applications to run that have been authorized. And then the fourth one was down to processes and procedures and things like not automatically assigning people with admin rights, but giving them just the sort of standard user access to reduce the scope of any attack that comes their way. It doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, that somebody doesn't have a legitimate need to log in sometimes as an admin, but it means that even if you do have those rights, you don't use them as your normal day-to-day access. So that was kind of their key guidance. And I think sometimes, you know, it's not unlike domestic security, you know, where if I have window locks, if I have a deadbolt on the door, and if I have a burglar alarm, I'm not impregnable. But it does mean that I've raised the bar significantly on somebody that, you know, is looking to burgle my house. And I think those things of make sure there's security software on there, make sure they're updated, make sure you're backing up that data, go a long way towards reducing that risk or reducing your exposure to attack.
And Mike, again, your views on the sort of the housekeeping stuff I think that smaller organizations should be doing.
Yeah, I think if you're a smaller organization, one of the things that you can do that a lot may not think to do is lean on your vendors a little bit, who provide you with kind of things like antivirus software and any kind of tools and utilities. Honestly, we're going to probably see a contraction in the cybersecurity industry as with most of the economy after this. So now is a great time for people to kind of lean on their vendors to establish relationships that will kind of go further after everything kind of settles back down. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about there, I mean, I recently at Particle just negotiated to extend our antivirus contract with a vendor there, and as part of that negotiation, I asked them to throw in coverage outside of the enterprise contract for people to install like a home antivirus software, because home networks are going to be pretty key areas to tighten up for any business, small or large, going forward. And they were very willing to do that to kind of sweeten the deal and get us to sign that extension. So it's, these companies are going to be contracting and vying for long-term business. Right now, not many people are going to be making big purchases on IT security tools, especially in smaller companies, because obviously they're going to want to preserve capital. But taking advantage of some of those value-added extras and some services and having that kind of layered in to help those vendors kind of provide services into the future and build lasting relationships is definitely a good tip I would give out.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I think that's a good point, Mike. And you're right. I mean, especially when you're looking at managed service providers as well. I mean, this is what they do for a living, is kind of manage stuff for people. And it's definitely worth asking those questions of your IT partners and seeing how they can help actually through this.
Excellent. Thanks for that, chaps. So I think taking this, I suppose the idea of the world of cybersecurity borrows a lot from the world of biology and medicine. The NHS, I think, what I've found interesting as a sort of professional communicator really is how consistent the NHS has been with this idea of hand washing. Hand washing saves lives. I'm just wondering if there's something we, as a sort of community, can learn from that. Are there any sort of what are the basic hygiene things that we should all be doing as practitioners? What should we be telling our customers to do? What should we be asking our staff to do?
Well, I think we've talked already, Mike and myself, about the how important the human factor in this is. I think if businesses didn't realize already, the current situation will underline how important it is that staff are aware. And I think, sometimes we can get into a zone of trying to sort of say to people, well, this is what phishing looks like, and this is what legitimate looks like, as opposed to maybe trying to develop a wider security culture. And it's developing that, I think, because if we look at the success of phishing scams, we look at the success of social engineering generally, it's pretty clear that it's been consistently successful. And while it's easy to kind of look at technical solutions because there's something tangible that you've got in your hands, so to speak, as against to the shaping human behavior, nevertheless, that shaping of human behavior is really important. And we can see from what the NHS is doing in terms of real world hygiene around COVID-19, they see that as important. And we're getting the drip of information in the same way that people of my generation, for example, grew up with information about not drink driving, or information about wearing a seatbelt, or child safety information films. And we're seeing the same approach. And actually, businesses can take a leaf out of that book and really look to get the core messages out to people. And I think sometimes as a non-expert, there's a risk that you think this is really hard. And yet actually, if you focus on some of those core things, then actually it becomes more manageable. And I think once people feel something is manageable, then you're likely to have more success in getting them to try and change what their behavior is. And in the present climate, that we've got everything here from how to manage group meeting applications right through to, you know, security software, updating, you know, and the do's and don'ts around passwords and responding to unsolicited messages.
Thank you, David. I'm acutely aware, Mike, that you have to leave us quite soon. So is there anything you'd like to add before you go?
I guess, yeah, the kind of thing that I would say is, you know, probably the next wave that we have to deal with in security is kind of what we do after this and as we kind of return to normality, because that will provide kind of another opportunity for malicious actors to kind of act, essentially. So to give you an example of that, like if we do start to bring people back to the office, and you know, there's a lot of places that are still hiring and have done remote onboarding and things like that over the past few weeks. So we're going to be in a very unique spot where we're going to have new hires returning or going to offices that they have never been to before, and meeting coworkers face to face that they've never met before. And that in itself brings new challenges from social engineering perspectives and gaining access to buildings and things like that, especially in larger organizations, which are pretty much the ones that are still remotely onboarding. So my advice would be there is, as we get ready for kind of the after of this, in a security team, make sure that you're involved kind of with HR and facilities and people like that to kind of come up with the plan to make sure that that process can go as smoothly as possible.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks very much.
So, David, I think it's just you and I think Brian may be back in the room. Well, I mean, David, one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about actually is that every year BCS does its IT leaders report, where we go out to the community, to IT leaders and chief information security officers, and ask them about the sort of stuff that's keeping them awake at night. Unsurprisingly, cybersecurity generally comes out on top, but this year cloud was equally kind of important and equally kind of prominent in the minds of boardrooms. I'm just wondering about your opinions about cloud and security. Is there a tendency, do you think, or a temptation to think that security is done when data's in the cloud, when organizations are in the cloud?
I think there can be. I mean, the cloud, obviously, especially under current situations, is a real benefit, simply because people can have access to it from anywhere with whatever device they're using. But there is sometimes that danger of people thinking that they outsource the security aspects of it with the provision. And it's interesting, actually, that, you know, one of the things which certainly used to come up around cloud was the worry that people have that maybe the cloud provider might not be secure. People might get access to the data that they're looking after. And yet, if we look over the last 18 months, 2 years, really the biggest issue has been you know, provision that hasn't been configured properly, and therefore data has been accessible because of that, as opposed to what you would call a breach of those systems. So it's in a sense, it's as opposed to somebody kicking my front door down, they're kind of pushing at the doors and the windows until they find one that's unlocked. So I think it's really important that people really, when they're thinking about the cloud, they're really considering it as an outreach of their own systems, and that they would actually do to data to secure it the same thing they would do if they were provisioning it themselves in-house. So, you know, if it's sensitive, then think about encrypting it. And remembering also that while that that cloud server may not be within your premises, your access to it is coming from your endpoints, and therefore if they're not secure, whether that's because of poor password policy or practice, or whether that's because, you know, they're not defended very well technically, then, you know, that's going to be the way that somebody is more likely to get into it.
So you're that endpoint security, really, you're saying is a sort of fundamental tenet.
Well, it is, in the sense that, you know, if I have access to any facility, and my access to that is weak. You know, if my password's easily guessable, if I'm not very careful about it, if I reuse the same credentials elsewhere, then if there's a compromise somewhere else, so you know, if my Amazon login and password is compromised because of a breach there, and somebody looks at it and says, oh, okay, so you know, that's David M at Kasperksy, then I wonder if that person uses the same credentials for their corporate login, and bingo, yes they do, then suddenly they're in, simply because they've assumed my identity, and anybody who is able to capture my credentials is then effectively me as far as that system is concerned.
Excellent. Well, I think we've had some questions in from the audience. We have one question in about. Yes, why not? You take over, please, Brian.
No, it's all right. I've got the questions here, Martin. So I thought I'd do the bit. We've swapped now, haven't we?
Yeah,
I'm back now. Here's a question, David. What did the panel make of the situation whereby House Party have become the subject of a Twitter rumour that they've been hacked? Epic Games are now alleging this is a commercial smear campaign and are offering a bounty to the first person who can identify those behind it. Could it be people are duped into using a fake app that's harvesting credentials, or is it the old problem of credential reuse, or something nastier?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's several possible responses, I suppose. The first is that somebody is just making mischief, you know, that good old friend of ours, fake news that we hear so much about. And somebody making mischief by doing that and damaging somebody's reputation. It costs nothing to spread rumors at the end of the day. It could also be that, you know, somebody is, you know, creating a looky-likey app, which isn't secure. I mean, we did a check recently of the files that we were seeing, which were trying to mimic social meeting applications. And we found, this was last week, about 1,300 files with names similar to applications like Zoom, WebEx, Slack, and so on. And actually, by far and away, the biggest was being targeted with Skype. So people are certainly doing that, and that's a possibility. Given the response of House Party, you know, you would think they would feel pretty sure that there was no obvious vulnerability that they were aware of. And it's interesting, actually, that they've taken the line of the bug bounty, because these days a lot of companies have bug bounty programs whereby, you know, what they're looking to do is to encourage researchers out there to actually identify vulnerabilities in the system, report them to them, so that they can fix them before the black hat guys find out about them. So actually, it's quite a measured response, and what they're doing here as a sort of one-off response is what many companies are now doing as an ongoing program to on the basis that, well, actually we can look to pin down vulnerabilities that may exist, but actually if we can employ people to do that for us, then so much the better, because, you know, as you know, when you can't really mark your own homework, you can't do it as effectively perhaps as somebody else. You know, anyone who's written an article will know you get to a point where you stop seeing any typos in it, and yet you hand it to somebody else. No, exactly, and so having somebody proofread your code makes sense, certainly.
Yeah, no, that sounds very sensible. I've got quite a philosophical question in here, David, as well, but I'm going to spring this on you. Can medicine learn from InfoSec in terms of protecting populations from viruses, in inverted commas?
Wow, it's an interesting one. I mean, I've been in the industry quite a while, and 1990 actually, where, you know, the viruses we saw were in the tens rather than even reaching into the hundreds, or as we now say, I mean, we process about 1 million objects every day. And the term virus was borrowed really because these things spread. But I do remember a former chief exec of the first company I worked for in this industry saying that, and this was circa 1997, by the way, saying, you know what, if we had to start again, we'd probably call them weeds rather than viruses. Right. And I guess what I would say about it is that although the term the terms are similar. We're talking about different things. I mean, for one thing, biological viruses are living organisms and they feed off other living organisms, whereas what we're talking about here is human written code designed to actually operate within computer systems. And so for a start, they're doing what they're coded to do. And yes, they can be unintended side effects, but we're not dealing with something like, COVID-19 or the flu or SARS or anything else. So, I'm sure where maybe there's overlap is in the use of technology. I know we make heavy use of machine learning alongside human expertise. Certainly when you're analyzing huge data sets, then being able to use computers to do that is much more efficient. And I'm sure that goes on in research for biological viruses as well. But I think in terms of the operation of the two, I would see them as distinct, to be honest.
Yeah, that's very reasonable. Now, as you know, I dropped out for a big chunk of this, so forgive me if I'm asking the same thing again. But we were talking about the equivalent in security and cybersecurity of the hand washing regime, a simple message that people can latch onto. Now, I suppose that's going to have different perspectives in it. There might be an organisational approach and there's an individual approach. In terms of an organisation, David, that's now seen its constituents parts scattered across parts of the country, if not the world. What's the simple high-level principle or principles they should be keeping in mind?
Yeah, well, I think, if I mentioned earlier on, and Mike did too, about how for larger companies, they've probably got experience of managing people working remotely. But for the small and medium-sized businesses that don't, they're having to sort of ramp up their expertise pretty quickly. And I think the sort of things to think about really are, defining a communication channel. To stop people just reaching for whatever the nearest thing is. Decide what you want to use and look at it and look at what the security and privacy settings are. Set out some guidelines for using those community or communication channels so that everybody, if you like, is on the same page and using the same system. I think also, in terms of equipment, again, it may be that for a lot of companies, people are not provisioned with company kit, but they're being expected to use their own kit for work. And in that sort of bring your own device environment par excellence, again, you might not have direct control, but you could lay down some procedures in terms of software for protecting it, in terms of recommendations about updating the operating system and applications, in terms of routine backup of data, and also, some guidance about some basic stuff about how to deal with unsolicited messages, not responding to those, password guidance, and maybe even looking at technology that can help. So if staff are worried about, oh my goodness, how do I have unique complex passwords for everything? Well, maybe think about investing in a password manager, which will do that hard graft for them. So I think looking at a series of processes and procedures that will help people just to focus themselves. And while you were offline, Brian, one of the things I'd said was that in domestic security, the deadbolts and the window locks and the burglar alarm go a long way in terms of reducing my risk to a burglary. And similarly, protecting a device, updating it, and backing up the data and not responding to those unsolicited messages will go a long way towards reducing the exposure to attack.
So really, it's still the basic sort of security IT message that we've been talking about as an industry for 20 years, if not more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But in the present circumstances, of course, in some cases the company can't be the backstop that maybe it was before, because people are literally outside of that that defensive wall now. Yeah.
Got one other question just come in, David, from Anthony Harrison. Thanks, Anthony. Any guidance on where to work when working remotely? Is having a house full of smart assistants providing a new attack vector?
I think that's a good point. You know, I think we talk about smart speakers, but we all know that they can be smart listeners as well. And from a confidentiality point of view, that's very true. And over the last 12 months, you know, we've gone from a position where we just assumed they were only activated when we said a keyword to, oh, well, actually, maybe they're active at other times, to a situation where the vendors themselves have admitted, well, yeah, there are conditions under which we gather data and analyze it. So I think we definitely need to look at that and recognize that actually, if we're doing confidential, either personal or business work, then actually we need to think about, if it's confidential, how confidential is it if someone or something can listen into what I'm doing? It's a good point.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. Yeah, good. Thank you. Now, Martin, any other questions come through from your side of things, or have we got to a point now?
I think we're done. Just scrolling down through the questions.
Okay,
I think we're done.
Good. David, can I thank you so much for your participation today? It's been really interesting.
My pleasure.
I heard about 3/4 of it, and I wish I heard the other bit. But and obviously, we'd like to thank Mike as well, who's had to leave us now. I'm just going to put it on our last slide here, just to thank the listeners as well for tuning in today. Next week, it's going to be Tuesday, the webinar for Vital Workers, Tuesday, 21st of April. Time to be announced, but it'll be how is COVID-19 changing NHS IT? We've got 3 CIOs to speak on that panel, so we'll look forward to that next week. David, thank you very much. Thank you for your help, Martin, as well, and thank you very much for tuning in.